Hi, my name is Amy Wolf with VUCast. America is about to make history with the election of our first African-American president, Barack Obama. Joining me today is Associate Provost of Undergraduate Education and Professor of Philosophy, Lucius Outlaw Jr., and Director of African-American Studies, Tracy Sharpley Whiting. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
First of all, and this is a question for both of you, take me back to election night and when you knew that Barack Obama was going to be our next president.
Oh gosh. Well, we were in bed actually. not he and I. But I know, right? You don't want Frida Gilman to misread that one, you know, as the results start rolling in, and they were, of course, we were watching MSNBC, and so you could see that they were eager to be able to call West Coast, the results out of the West Coast, which they knew were going to be in Obama's favor, and so it was a very fascinating moment. I didn't necessarily, I know there was a lot of crying and whatnot. I wasn't crying. I mean, I always kind of knew that Obama was going to win. It was like follow the money trail. And so it was, for me, one of those moments. It was just a confirmation that the process actually worked.
And how did you feel about that, especially in a historical perspective?
You know, at the particular moment, it was less historical for me because I was actually in a different mode. I first was going to be at home because wasn't sure how I was going to react. So I said to Frida, I want to be at home just with you watching this. And then I remembered a friend had invited us to her condo up on West End, and we said, oh, we got to go by. So we went there, and that's where we were when the returns were coming in. And I was actually in her den where she has a sectional sofa, and a group of people were sitting around the sofa looking at a large screen TV, and I was sitting behind with my camera on the table and happened to look up, and the TV was on CNN, and CNN made the call. And I was sitting behind, grabbed the camera, focused on the screen, and captured everybody in there and snapped just as the projection went up. And there are all these African Americans sitting around, one person standing, and no one was moving. Everybody was dead still at that moment the projection came on. They weren't moving, they weren't cheering, anything. And I made the shot, and split second later, the room just erupted, you know, into praise and cheers. And one of the persons sitting there with his back to me is George Birch, you know, who has his own history on the bench in Tennessee and Nashville, for whom the building is named downtown. So it was a pretty powerful moment. And then we stayed for a while and left, and I shot some more, and we went home, and Frida was watching TV saying, I'm going to D.C. for the inauguration. So, well, I'm going to D.C. Okay, and I look at my calendar and says, oh, well, I have to be there for a meeting. I think I'll stay on, too. She says, well, it'd be very nice if you accompany me, but I'm going to be in D.C. for the inauguration. I don't care what.
So now both of you are going to the inauguration. How do you feel about that? Are you excited to witness that?
Now that is exciting.
Yeah,
that will be quite exciting. At the same time, I mean, it was like what Lou said. I mean, after the thing, and we had already had hotel reservations. And so it was just a matter of booking plane reservations. So as you're watching it, you know, you're on, you know.
So you were that confident you knew this was going to happen?
Yeah, we had already had hotel reservations. And so it was like, okay, so what airline will we take? And so that was where we were. But yeah, we'll be at the inauguration, quite excited about it. It's going to, of course, be, you know, crazy there, but that's a part of it. It's a part of it.
Yeah, it's about, you know, someplace, where are you at certain moments in history? And part of this is simply being present in that city in that moment. Now, I plan to be shooting like crazy and taking 3 or 4 days to try to figure out what are the best locations, where can I be, what can I shoot, what can I do. But part of it is to be in the nation's capital at this particular turning of the wheel of history in this country. I mean, you only get to live this first once.
Yes.
So it's a question of where do you do it, and it's about being there.
So why do you think it's so important to the United States and to the world to have an African-American president?
Well, I think it's important to the United States to have a good president. And so ultimately, I think that Barack Obama will make a wonderful president. I do think that at this particular moment, for a great deal of people globally, the idea that the United States, which of course, Obama likes to call an interesting kind of experiment in democracy, has in some respects lived up to its creed with this particular historic election. And so I think it's a confirmation that we can move beyond certain of the old politics and stalemates and wounds and make something like this happen. And so I think that that's what's especially important, and I think that that's what the world sees. And I guess as a person who also has a PhD in French, France is particularly impacted by Obama's candidacy. And I think part of the reason is the fact that they have the largest immigrant and what they call visible minority group in Europe. And the idea that it's the one country in Europe that does not keep statistics according to race, the whole idea is that everyone is French and so citizens are equal and indistinguishable, that Obama's candidacy and the race speech in particular for them was a moment in which perhaps they needed to think about this whole category, and that in fact race was a category of discrimination, and could they, if they dealt with this question, is it possible for a French Obama to emerge? And so it's been very interesting to watch some of the back and forths in terms of the political landscape, because you see a softening. I mean, Nicolas Sarkozy was a right-wing politician. I mean, he kind of rode in promising all sorts of things to the extreme right. And some of his rhetoric since 2007 has seriously evolved, and he's begun to co-opt a great deal of Obama's rhetoric, which at a time, and in Europe, they can be quite cynical, and this whole idea of hope and, and everything, whatever. But I mean, they're so into it now. They desperately are looking for a different way to envision their future. And so he has talked about diversity and inclusion, and the idea that that French culture is made up of all of these things. This was an absolute no-no. But the rhetoric is somehow, taking root there. And they had a commission brought together, the Veil Commission, that began to look at perhaps institutioning a constitutional amendment, a reform that would in fact allow what they call positive discrimination or affirmative action in our case, or at least allow the discussion around race. They decided not to amend the Constitution, but in fact, what they did do is recognize that they have to, though the Republic may say that it's colorblind, people are not, and they have to do something about it. But what was fascinating is that they cite from the race speech. That speech was translated immediately into French with an introduction, and so his candidacy has certainly resonated in Europe.
What's interesting about that is that Obama really hasn't talked a lot, or during the election didn't talk a lot about race, except for that speech. So how do you feel about how he handled the race issue during the election, and now how it's being discussed now that he's going to be president?
Well, he handled it extraordinarily well. He dealt with it explicitly when he thought he needed to. Otherwise, he never made it a focal point of the definition of who he was and what he was about, while never, ever avoiding a definition of himself that would include a racial identity, while simultaneously never denying who his mother was and who his grandparent was. So he was exceptionally adept at carrying and dealing with without having to make a focal point of what has been a driving factor in the history of this country and the Western world since the 1600s and even before. So I think if we, the historical significance of this for the United States, we just trace it much about it's the importance of having a very good and capable president. Well, what is very striking about this moment is, in terms of the presidency of the United States, for the first time in the history of this country, we have a confirmation that being African American and being competent is not an oxymoronic combination. We've never had this before, ever. For most of the history in this country, being African American meant not being capable or qualified, by definition. this is a threshold moment in the history of this country that we have come to this. It has happened before in some other places, slowly, gradually, etc., but never before at this level in this country. So it's an extraordinary moment.
And Obama isn't coming alone. I mean, I am blown away when I see the images and the interviews of the whole Obama family, and especially Michelle. What do you guys think about that? What impact will the whole first family have on this country?
It's going to be huge, but I think there's been preparation for that. I mean, I think when I say preparation, I think we got to go back to Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby became the national dad. You know, that show, The Cosby Show, became one of the most highly watched shows for several years in this country. So there's been some preparation for that in a particular kind of interesting way. And I think part of what made Obama's election possible was that, in fact, we've had preparation underway in some very subtle ways such that you could have this kind of election go on. I mean, it wasn't African Americans who made Obama a national figure as a presidential candidate. It was white Americans who first did that, and a lot of us had to become convinced that this was really a viable path. Not that we didn't think that there were African Americans who were capable. We've known that for a couple of hundred years. It was whether a lot of other people, particularly white Americans, were going to agree and in fact cast a vote. I mean, plenty of African Americans are still saying they're not going to go, and they are not going to do it. They're not going to go behind the curtains of a ballot box and vote for an African American. They simply won't do it. Well, in point of fact, it happened. But there was a lot of preparation along the way, and I think a lot of preparation was happening in colleges and universities. So that if you look back at what has been called multicultural education over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have 2 or 3 generations of young people of all racial and ethnic groups who have been prepared for this moment in a way that no other generations in the history of the United States had been prepared intellectually, psychologically, and emotionally.
No, I think that's very interesting, the idea of what students have to say, because when I talk to people of different generations, I find it fascinating what their opinions are on President Obama. So what have you heard from young people on the issue of race and just on the issue of Obama being our next president?
Well, I think what Lou says is really important. The youth vote was very important, was very crucial to the Obama campaign. But I think we have to really look down in the numbers to see that the youth turnout was certainly a high turnout, but it was just a little bit higher than normal. Obama was able to carry the election because of the white independent vote and the African American vote. So this is an interesting coalition that we have emerging now. It used to be African Americans and labor and the white liberal cohort, and so but the bulk of that came from independents and African Americans, and so we have a new kind of politics emerging. I do think what we find with the youth vote, as Lou said, a great deal of education has gone on. A great deal of popular culture has also informed their worldviews, so that Will Smith, as he talks about, of course, Bill Cosby, or Will Smith for this generation, and for the previous generation, most Americans, prefer to spend an evening at the movies with Will Smith. I mean, he's, Hollywood's most bankable, actor. And so, and this generation grew up listening to Will Smith. And so, and he, of course, has always struck a different kind of pose with respect to racial identity, if you will. Certainly not shying away from his racial identity, but this is a generation in which racial identity is important. Obama's a part of this generation. It's important. We understand the pernicious effects of racism, but we are not weighted down by it. And so this, I think, is a break with the traditional civil rights generation. So, and so while one may be kind of caught up in kind of grievance politics of old, this is a generation that is kind of like, that's probably not the best way to kind of navigate the landscape and the playing field. With young voters as well, I think they've been watching shows like 24. where they had 2 black presidents. So it was not for most Americans far-fetched. I mean, this was a very popular show. So for me, it was never a question of whether Obama's candidacy as an African, he was the right kind of African American. I want to be clear. I think a great deal of white people felt very comfortable with him because his mother was white. We are not at a post-racial moment, no matter what people say. What we do have is a post-racial candidate. And that's a very different thing than arguing that the country is post-racial. So for me, the biggest challenge was going to be whether the U.S. was going to be, the voters were going to be willing to accept a black first lady. Because the whole idea of lady and black women is itself, a contradiction, has been certainly in our history. And so it was about Michelle Obama. And I think the campaign recognized that, as Lou said, they've been preparing for this early on. When she made a few gaffes, immediately they rushed in to begin to soften her edges, to make her even more, African-American girl next door, a more empathetic figure, cut the kind of edge, shave the edges down a bit. And and so for a lot of people, the idea that, you would have a black woman that one would call a first lady was going to be certainly a new phenomena. Big time. That you have a black woman who is certainly, sleeping in the bedroom legitimately. And being served on Haviland china rather than serving. And so I think that was, for me, one of the moments to see if we were going to be able to make it over that particular hump.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, looking at the fact that they are a very traditional nuclear family. And I feel, those images, you talk about taking all the photographs. I mean, what do you think of that image? I keep thinking of the picture of after Obama gave his acceptance speech, and they all came out, and we see that image again and again. How do you think that is instilling into people?
I mean, it's going to do a tremendous amount of work. Look, if you would go back and look at national and local newscasts where the subject of discussion, let's say, is welfare. Now, the majority of the people on welfare are not people of African descent. They're actually white. But if you would look at the footage that runs in the background for whoever is sitting in front of that camera, when welfare is being talked about, and you just go back over the years, and we've got the archives, we could actually go do a research study on this. What are the images in the background when discussing welfare? It's overwhelmingly of black female. So we have embedded in the psyche of this country notions that involve a corruption of an insight that Daniel Patrick Moynihan had about the structure of black family life in this country coming out of slavery and what that has meant. I mean, I think that got taken up, abused, and misused in some important ways, but it became embedded in the psyche of this country that African-American family life was really structured fundamentally around women who were uneducated, irresponsible, having repeated children out of wedlock, and then looking for the state to take care of them by virtue of welfare. It's not true, but that became the overwhelming image of the black family in America. And that's why I say the Cosby Show was really did some important cultural, psychological work. The Obamas will confirm that at the highest level in this country. There are some undercurrents, though. My wife was in a context where that current broke the surface, and it's an undercurrent of certain white females of a particular generation who are angry. They are angry because, here's the way the conversation went. Why is he being called African American? His mother was white. Why did he marry a black woman? So that you've got some white females, particularly of a certain generation, who have their own issues now about Obama's identity. How does his white mother figure into all of this? Is there a denial of her because he's being defined as African American? And my wife's response was, wait a minute, you all made the rule. You all defined the one-drop rule. We didn't define that. And why is he married to a black woman? That was the person he chose to marry. But there is this resentment now among some white women of a particular generation, et cetera, about their role in all of this and whether they get to claim anything about this man and his ascendancy to the presidency. So there's going to be some contestation around this man and his achievements, racial contestation of a new kind now, and playing out gender and racial politics in a whole new way that I think that is already at work beneath the surface in the country around this man's ascendancy.
Lou is absolutely right. I think the interesting thing is he says the pictures that you keep talking about are doing the cultural work about intact black families. But of course, Michelle Obama herself was from an intact black family, whereas Obama himself was not. So I think the idea that, the one thing that they would constantly say is that we are not exceptional. And so some of the other kinds of popular cultural work that we see happening is as he says, images of welfare queens, affirmative action babies, undeserving this, criminally minded black men, et cetera, when in fact, there is a range, a diversity of black life in this country. There are plenty of intact black families. We have them. But statistics don't seem to do the work. The images do, because we're such a visual culture. I think he's absolutely right when he talks about this undercurrent, and it's interesting to hear this is what Frida was running up against, but when you also heard a lot of voters, when they were attempting to justify why they were voting for Obama, the level of comfortability, the fact that his mother was white. And that's all well and good, but the interesting point for me is he could claim no other identity. No white person walking on the street looking at a Barack Obama would have thought he was anything but black, would have treated him as anything but black. But now that he has ascended to the highest office in the land, everyone wants a stake in Obama's ascendancy, and but this is also a part of Obama's political his deaf political skills. Yeah. He is an invitational politician. He wants you, right. Exactly. He wants you to draw upon him whatever it is you want to draw upon him. And in fact, he can be all of those things, and still be an African American. He said, African American life has been codified and circumscribed by a certain racial politics that, white folk, have, certainly come up with. And so there was no other way. And so it's interesting to me, those individuals who've never read like his memoirs. Right. It's very clear he struggled to figure out what it meant to be a black man in America growing up in a white family. Right. He could not be anything but. And his mother was quite clear in that was what his identity was. And so it's baffling to me. No one is attempting to acclaim, say, Halle Berry, whose mother's white, right. Jennifer Beals, whose mother's white. There are so many mixed race, if you will. Mm-hmm. I have a problem with that term as well because, given the history of, race mixing in this country, who isn't? There are so many who are. Why Obama? And that has to be the real question. But I think Obama's candidacy definitely defines a moment in which white folks decided to to invest in their self-interest, which were economic, and not invest in whiteness. That the wages of whiteness simply weren't paying the same way, were not giving the dividends, the payoff that their economic self-interests were going to yield by voting for Obama versus a McCain. And I think that we have to be very clear about those kind of race politics in this country.
It's a breakthrough moment in the history of the country. There have always in the history of this country been what you had to learn early on growing up in Mississippi, as I did. You always had to know who were the good white folks, because not all white people have ever been the same on the racial spectrum. They have always been in various positions. They have always been people who helped to make a difference. Sometimes they did it very subtly. They didn't want public recognition. It could cost them if they were thought to be nigger lovers, and so they had to figure out how to negotiate that. There are others who would come out and put their life at risk and who gave their lives. Viola Luozo, for example. Here's a white woman from Detroit who was murdered for coming out because she thought this was the right thing to do. What is different now is that those white folk, those good folk, aided by successive generation of young people who've been educated formally into the popular culture, have now constitute a critical mass that help to tip the balance in a direction unprecedented in the history of the United States of America. And my prediction is we are not going to go backwards.
Good.
We're going to keep going forward. I mean, I really believe
that's right.
that there are a significant enough number of white folk of these convictions. They're not the majority yet, but they do, in combination with those other folk that Trace was pointing out, that come together to form a new kind of coalition, they do constitute a critical mass that have now tipped the balance of history of the United States in a way it has never, ever been and was never intended by the founders. Never intended. This was never intended by the founders. Has never been before been attended to in this way in the history of the United States of America. And I think those folk, those white Americans, have no intention of going backwards.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating. I wish we could talk about this for an hour. Lucius Outlaw Jr. and Tracy Sharpley Whiting, thank you so much. And please stay tuned with VUCast. We'll have more of these type of conversations in the future. Thank you.